I will not, we have an excellent panel. That's an excellent panel, Mr. Amsterdam. Thank you again for coming through. And then we have Ms. Fatma Karume should be joining us a little later on. And then of course, we've got Mr. Joseph Oleshangay from Legal Human Rights Center. He's a program officer as well as a lawyer. And Legal Human Rights Center is one of the leading organizations in Tanzania. Hela, I'm not too sure if we are able to post their bios without me having to go into detail in the chat. Then in addition, we can also share Twitter handles. It's a public event. And if you as we go along, if you feel that there are any nuggets that you want to share on social media, please go ahead. You can tag any of the speakers. We'll share their social media handles in the chat section. A little housekeeping, we'll start off with presentations from our panelists, and then we will have a open, a discussion, question and answer session at the end. I think I will take individual questions. No need to write them in the chat unless for some reason you're unable to raise your hand and speak. Ms. Fatma Karume was supposed to be our first speaker, generally giving an overview of the human rights situation and rule of law situation in Tanzania. But Mr. Amsterdam will go first. Mr. Amsterdam is an international lawyer. Amsterdam Partners is an international law firm. He's currently representing Mr. Freeman Mbowe, chairman of the Chadema opposition party in Tanzania. Awesome. I think Fatma has just joined.
Yeah.
Lifesaver.
Lifesaver is right.
I was trying to wing it there, but yes, Fatma, are you? Awesome, great. I was just, doing introductions, so I will introduce you. Up next, Fatma Karume. She's a senior human rights lawyer, senior constitutional law lawyer in Tanzania. She's a past president for the Tanganyika Law Society. And yes, Fatma, thank you for coming through. And I will pass it on to you immediately. My first question to you is for you to give us an overview of the rule of law situation, the rule of law and human rights situation in Tanzania. But I wanted you to, primarily focus on the period between since President Magufuli's passing away and current President Saima taking power.
I think what is clear is that since the passing away of Magufuli, there has been a lot of hope in people in Tanzania. However, we haven't really had our hopes transformed into legislation or into reality. The president does talk about rule of law. She does talk about justice. She does want a country, so she says, which is run along the grounds of constitutionality, and also that is subject to rule of law. However, this has not transformed, this rhetoric has not been transformed into concrete actions. What do I mean by that? You see, when I say we need rule of law, they are institutional weaknesses within our country that need to be resolved for us to have rule of law. Now, when the president says she is in support of rule of law, it's very promising and it's very hopeful. But we need to see more than just rhetoric. We need to see a legislative program that will entrench rule of law within our institutions. And we're not getting that. What we're getting is a lot of warnings, a lot of, recently we had the police warned by the Minister of Home Affairs because we have a police force that is unfortunately extremely brutal and violent and is notorious for torturing people. And recently they tortured somebody to death. And all we got from the Minister of Home Affairs was a warning from the minister telling the police, to be careful, otherwise action will be taken against them. But we have not seen the formation of an independent commission to investigate the police, or an independent police complaints commission. So the police then turn around and say, we're going to investigate ourselves. Now, this is not good enough. We all know that you cannot have rule of law when the police are asked to investigate themselves. So this is the sort of thing that is not acceptable. Lots of rhetoric, but no concrete action representing this rhetoric.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit more on, human rights, democracy, freedom of expression, association, and assembly? We know that in the run-up to the October 2020 elections, under Magufuli, there was a lot of clamping down on citizens, especially government critics, you included. Has the current administration lightened up on the crackdown on fundamental freedoms?
No, it hasn't. I'll give you an example. I mean, I think the whole world knows that Freeman Mbowe, who is the head of the opposition, has been accused of terrorism. It's a completely trumped up charge. But that aside, we have to look at what has been happening to other members of Chadema, just sort of the run-of-the-mill normal members of Chadema. So the reason why Freeman Mbowe was accused of terrorism was he was pushing for constitutional reform, what we call the Katiba Mpya movement. Tanzania has an extremely onerous constitution with respect to human rights. And it creates what we call an imperial presidency. And we have been wanting and pushing for the amendment of this constitution for quite a while. And so Mbowe was arrested because he was calling for the amendment of this constitution. And members of his party printed T-shirts, red T-shirts with the words Katiba Mpya, new constitution, on the front in white. They all get rounded up and routinely thrown into prison, police cells, for a prolonged period of time for wearing a T-shirt that simply says Katiba Mpya, new constitution. We have seen members of the Chadema party, the women's wing, being arrested and thrown into police cells for daring to jog with T-shirts that say Katiba Mpya, a new constitution. So this is not just a question of the leader of the opposition. It really is a clampdown on freedom of expression, particularly with respect to the Katiba Mpya movement, the requirement of a new constitution. The president of the United Republic of Tanzania, Samia Suluhu Hassan, has said she does not want to consider the new constitution. It is not time, she doesn't have the time to discuss it right now. She wants to proceed to look at the economy. And accordingly, she doesn't have time to discuss the new constitution. Now, that's all well and good for her, but it doesn't mean that the rest of us shouldn't have the right to discuss the new constitution, because we do have freedom of expression. We're not doing anything illegally. Neither are Chadema when they call for a new constitution. And I think it is time for her to realize that this is their right. It's a fundamental right. And she may not, just as much as she has a right to ignore them, she has the right not to discuss the new constitution or the requirement of a constitution. She has the right to ignore the Tanzanian people if she so wishes. Hopefully she'll pay for it in 2025 if she continues to ignore. But ultimately, as much as she has the right to ignore us, we also have the right to continue to push for a new constitution, because it is our fundamental right, and it's the right to it's our right to freedom of expression. So I think one has to be very careful about how one looks at Samia Suluhu, because there are limitations with respect to her charm.
Thank you, Fatma. Just on, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of the Samia administration focusing on economic situation of the country at the expense of, or setting aside human rights issues as a priority. But I'm curious if you could just dive in a little bit more, and you knowing the Tanzanian concept, the Tanzanian context, a lot of individuals or other activists or political analysts on the continent have said that democracy is overrated, human rights are overrated, particularly on the African continent. We're still young, we should be focusing on the economy, and that human rights are secondary. But I would want you to dive a little bit deeper in terms of the connection between the economy and human rights or rule of law. Is it possible? And I know President Magufuli, when he came into power, focused on clamping down on corruption. So is it possible for President Samia's administration to actually grow, improve Tanzania's economy, minus without taking into consideration constitutional issues or the rule of law?
I don't think it's possible. I don't think you can grow an economy. I don't think you can attract investment, whether external foreign direct investment or internal investment, if you do not have rule of law and you do not have respect for some fundamental rights, such as the right to own property and freedom of expression. Why do I say that? Well, why would I want to continue investing in my own country, for example, if I don't have the right to go to court and have my case decided fairly against, for example, another person or the government? So why would I want to invest in assets in my own country if I have no confidence in the justice system? I have no confidence in the way laws are passed. And I think that the laws are passed in a very discriminatory manner, without discussion, and which are unconstitutional and will eventually be upheld by a court of law as constitutional. Why would I want to invest in a country that is basically lawless? Very few people invest in countries like that. First of all, the risk of investment is extremely high. Therefore, your returns, you're going to expect high returns. You're going to expect the returns to come quickly. And the cost of investment becomes extremely high, and it's bad actually for the economy, because what you're doing is you're attracting people who want to invest short-term, sort of quick run, hit and run, and get out as fast as possible. This is expensive money. You don't want expensive money. You want money that is less expensive, that is cheaper. Therefore, you want investments which will last a prolonged period of time. It is cheaper money, and people are expecting returns over a period of maybe 20 years or a 15-year return, and they have the stability. So this money becomes a cheaper source of money, a cheaper source of investment. It is better for a country as poor as we are, creating long-term jobs and security. So when investors feel secure, the cost, the risk cost is less. When investors feel insecure, the risk cost is higher and the cost of money becomes higher, and you have hit and run investors. This is extremely bad for a country as poor as Tanzania.
Thank you, Fatma. I have two more questions, but I will ask you one because I know Mr. Amsterdam has to leave, and I want to jump to him and give him an opportunity before his time is up. One more question that I want to ask you is, you've talked of the rule of law, individuals going to court, advocating for their right to property and so forth. And for me as a lawyer, and most of us, the panelists here being lawyers, the role that lawyers play in maintaining or upholding the rule of law. Your own case, you were arbitrarily suspended in 2019, and then just before the October 2020 elections, you were permanently disbarred from practicing, in Tanzania. I wanted you to just share thoughts on, if any, what are the implications of your case to the rest of the legal profession in Tanzania, but also not just the legal profession, but clients or citizens who are going to require or need legal services. So if you could share just a little bit about your own case, and then the implications of a case like yours on the independence of the legal profession in Tanzania.
So first of all, I'd like to make a connection between the independence of the legal profession and the independence of the judiciary. These two are interlinked. You cannot have an independent judiciary if the legal profession is not independent. So I think we have to start from there. Now, the Tanzanian legal profession has not been independent for some time. It's getting worse as I speak. Why do I say that? So we have never been a bar that self-regulates. We're in between self-regulation and being regulated by the executive. So in my instance, the Advocates Committee that ruled over me is a committee that is chaired by a judge of the High Court, but does not have quorum unless the Director of Public Prosecution, who is part of the executive, sits on the committee. And I was basically disbarred by this Advocates Committee. For many reasons. I mean, if you look at my case and you look at the reasons why I was disbarred permanently, the punishment itself, assuming I was wrong, let's assume I was wrong, is disproportionate. I mean, you don't disbar me indefinite. You don't disbar me absolutely because I have said things that the Attorney General doesn't like about himself and about the president. I mean, even if that were irresponsible and contrary to my legal profession and my you still, it's disproportionate, completely disproportionate. But you can see from my case that everything in Tanzania is politicized. Even even when it comes to dealing with lawyers, it's always politicized. And it is the executive that is ultimately in control of everything. So in this particular instance, I had sued the President of the United Republic of Tanzania for breaching the Constitution by appointing an Attorney General who did not have the requisite constitutional qualifications to be an Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General took absolute umbrage to the fact that I dared write a constitutional petition, draft a constitutional petition in which I accused him of not having the requisite constitutional qualifications and being far too junior to actually be an Attorney General. But you know, these sort of things, they end up sorting themselves out, don't they? Because you can see the immaturity of the Attorney General, because what he actually did was, instead of defending himself and proving that he was constitutionally qualified, he made sure I was disqualified permanently as from the bar. So that was his way of having his taking his actions against me. So what then happened is the 3 judges of the court, of the High Court, disagreed with the panel. And unfortunately, I have still not been returned to the bar, because obviously the judiciary are playing games with my right to return to the bar. I should be returned to the bar, but they're asking me to write a letter because they say that I was disqualified. yes, I was disqualified, and therefore I have to write a special letter seeking special dispensation. Now, when you think about this, of course, this is nonsense, because if the High Court has decided that the decision of the court, of the Advocates Committee, was unlawful, then it no longer stands. I should be able to just go back and practice. The fact that the judiciary is now asking me to sort of beg them to return to practice shows the sort of the fact that it shows to me, it's indicative of the fact that they don't even respect their own judgments. You have a judiciary that doesn't respect its own judgments from 3 judges of the High Court. Who else is going to respect their judgments? Do we expect the executive to respect their judgments if they can't respect their own judgments? Oh, this is the other thing, by the way, to make it clear. Do you know who issues the practicing certificate for advocates in this country?
No, you have to. It's not the Law Society.
It's the judiciary.
Not the Law Society. The judiciary.
Judiciary.
The same judiciary that you criticized.
Yep, same judiciary which I criticized, and now they won't reach my practicing certificate.
Yes, I suppose other lawyers would be hesitant to criticize the judiciary, and how are we supposed to hold the judiciary accountable, like other government officials. Well, we continue as the ABA Justice Defenders Program, continue to work on Ms. Karume's case, and I will now turn to Mr. Amsterdam. I'll open it up for questions if anyone has questions for Ms. Karume a little later. But Mr. Amsterdam, once again, thank you for hosting us and for joining us on this panel. Fatma, Ms. Karume, sorry, Fatma, I default to our speaking terms, but Ms. Karume just briefly mentioned or highlighted the case of Mr. Freeman Mbowe. I know that you are the international lawyer representing him. I wanted you to just, share with us how you came about to handle Mr. Mbowe's case, and then also just dive in a little bit more about the actual case. I know Fatma just scratched the surface, but I'm sure would like to hear, more about the specifics of Mr. Mbowe's case and your role as an international attorney representing him.
Sure, thank you. Our firm has been very active in Tanzania, representing Mr. Tundu Lissu, who was the leader of Chadema in 2017 when he was shot 16 times, nearly killed in a shooting for which the government has never provided a proper explanation of their role. Magically, Tundu Lissu came back to fight in an election where he and Chadema did astoundingly well. In fact, there are many who believe they won the election. And in fact, the amount of flagrant electoral fraud, intimidation, murder, falsification of votes was just a completely shocking display of authoritarian violence. Immediately after, we had to exfiltrate Mr. Lissu from the country again. And as a result of those activities, we were asked to assist Freeman Mbowe, who, exactly as Fatma said, the charges he faces are transparently political. They relate to his activity on behalf of constitutional reform, allegations somehow relating to a threat to bomb gas stations. I mean, the actual allegations are out of a fictional comic book. The bottom line was he was putting together a very effective campaign to change a constitution that has no relevance to the modern era. The Constitution of Tanzania is not fit for purpose. It is a constitution that goes well beyond even the wildest dreams of an imperial presidency. There is literally no control on the executive. It is fraught with the stampings of a one-party state. And Freeman and others in Chadema realized that constitutional reform was critically necessary in order to ever stage a free election. The Electoral Commission, whom we cited as a firm numerous times in correspondence during the last election, is completely corrupt and report only to the president, and engaged in a massive amount of fraud during the last election. And I think what's extremely important, there have been some positive changes since Hassan took office, but let's be very clear. There is a grammar to governance. There are terms that are used, in terms of the judiciary, in terms of the executive, in terms of words like attorney general. These connote in Western minds certain duties and responsibilities that simply don't comport to what is happening on the ground in countries like Tanzania or Uganda or Cameroon or other similarly situated countries, where the duties are really all in favor of the authoritarian leadership. And there is no well-defined concept of public accountability. And when we talk about, you asked about the relationship between the economy and human rights. This is an issue that's incredibly important, and it's highlighted in Tanzania because the same people that firebombed Fatma's office, the same people that make it dangerous for my local colleagues on the panel to even exercise freedom of expression, these same people are kleptocrats. They are incredibly corrupt, and they are engaging in selective exploitation and expropriation of foreign-controlled assets. And that goes hand in hand with cases like Freeman and Mbowe. One of the things, we're making a pitch to Secretary Blinken, who has just arrived in Africa, and we're very sad he's not coming to Tanzania. But one of the things we are saying is this is an economic issue, because the attack on Mbowe is a demonstration, not only of lack of rule of law, but of the dangers of American companies investing in this country, because the same one-sided arbitrary crap that they've ladled onto Mbowe, they're going to do to any foreign company. And of course they did under Magufuli with Acacia Mining and many other cases, and they are continuing to do that. So the Freeman and Mbowe case, what's so important is it started under the new president. And whatever is being said by her or her acolytes, while a case so transparently fraudulent, and while Tanzania leads the world in using this unbailable offense criteria to lock up political opponents and never let them see the light of day. And I want to say that, a case recently came out that Fatma pointed me to, where the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention made a finding about this illegal use of non-bailable offenses. And again, this has Tanzania written all over it. Tanzania has a horrific record on rule of law. And what we have to do as international council, not only on behalf of Mbowe, but others in Africa, is bring to the Commonwealth, bring to the African Union, bring to all of the international financial organizations that are loaning money and donating to Tanzania, bring to their attention not only the kleptocracy, but these violations of basic legal norms. that are parading around as, yes, it's exciting that Magufuli is gone. And yes, it's exciting that in the 21st century, we are celebrating a leader who is willing to address COVID. Because in Tanzania, we had a leader who denied COVID existed until he died of COVID. There is such a thing as karma. So it is very important that this leader does not get a free ride. And I just also want to add on behalf of our firm that this is not the first case or the first time we've run into the ABA's work, and we are so delighted and so grateful to be working with you and your organization. And we think it's incredibly important that organizations like the ABA get involved. And, one of the things I've heard in Africa for 50 years is the constant argument of African authoritarians that the West should stay out of Africa and that the economy comes first and we are imposing Western values. Well, it couldn't be less true that these are Western values, because if you study African law, you understand where the community and the rights of basic respect and community responsibility begins and ends. What we're really talking about are basic communitarian values of respect for rules and organizing principles that are originating in African custom. There is nothing foreign about arguing that these political cases are anathema, not only in Africa, but internationally.
Thank you, sir. That was, very comprehensive. And I have follow-up questions, and I'll try and, they were not part of my scheduled questions, but from your presentation, I have follow-up questions. So we'll try and go through them really quickly. First and foremost, I wanted to say there are people, and, because I'm from Zimbabwe, and I know of cases where individuals or government critics have been accused of certain crimes, and the argument from government supporters has been, well, let the judicial system, run its course. So similarly, in Mr. Mbowe's case, if someone was to say to you, well, if Mr. Mbowe is innocent, then let him go through the judicial process and the court will find him, innocent, or he'll be judged based on the evidence presented against him. What are your thoughts on that, on allowing the judicial process to run through?
Well, firstly, I'm all for that. If you have a fair charging process, if you have an independent police organization, if you have an independent judiciary, I'm all for it. In the case of Tanzania, let alone Zimbabwe, in this case, none of that exists. And, I met this in a very significant case I did in Russia, where I was representing an oil tycoon who Putin wanted to steal all his assets. And so many people tried to argue that we should not go to international courts. We should stay in Russia and let the courts play out. When what we did was we went to the international courts to get the international courts to rule that the Russian courts were not actually engaging in rule of law behavior. And that's what we're saying about Mbowe's case. We're reaching out to the international community because this case is not law. And, it's incredibly important for all of us as lawyers to draw a distinction between law and politics. And where cases become completely political, where individuals like Mbowe or Kamto in Cameroon or Bobby Wine in Uganda, where they are charged with bogus offenses, but are forced to commit all their resources to either be stationed in jail or return to jail every 10 days to report and have their human and civil rights reduced, then this is a political attack and it needs to be addressed not only legally, but politically. And we do no favors to Tanzanian institutions by allowing them to parade around. And this is where we get to the grammar of rule. They are using terms which, I've often called the presumption of regularity. They are using terms like a prosecutor, a policeman. Well, that's fine if they're actually a prosecutor, but in this case, that's not the case. They're a henchman. They're a political goon who's operating for artificial rewards to keep a one-party kleptocracy in power. He doesn't deserve the term prosecutor. And I want to say, when it comes to the Tanzanian judiciary, there are some excellent members of that judiciary. And I don't want to make this kind of comment about the judiciary of Tanzania, because while we can say it about the police and while we can say it about many of the prosecutors, there have been some very important high court decisions in Tanzania which have reflected some level of independence. The problem is that they've been ransacked by political appointees of CCM that have gone very far in destroying their independence as well. But we have a distinguished panel. I'm not living in Tanzania, but I salute and pray every day for the people I collaborate with in Tanzania, Uganda, Cameroon, who face the danger every evening of coming home and finding their homes ransacked or worse. And when we do a webinar like this, it's important to point out the courage of people like Fatma who take this on, even though they've already, in her case, been exposed to firebombing and disbarment.
Absolutely agreed, Mr. Amsterdam, in terms of recognizing the work that Mr. Oleshangay and Fatma and Karume has been doing in Tanzania. My two last questions to you. One is, you have mentioned that President Samia, since coming into power, has done a few things that are commendable. So, for example, acknowledge that COVID is real, that there's a global pandemic, and taking greater steps to greater steps to protect the citizens against COVID. And then I think at some point she, lifted the suspension or ban on media houses. Media houses that were banned. In my engagements on Tanzania, with a number of other stakeholders, they have indicated that there's an air of optimism. Like, the response has been, let's wait and see. It's too early to judge. It's only been about 8 months. In your opinion, would you say that it's too early? Are we judging her too soon? Or those who say that, the title of this panel is what's left of hopes for Tanzania. So the assumption is that the hope that individuals had, unfortunately, at the passing of Magufuli, those have wound down since the coming in of Samia. Would you say that it's too early to judge her?
No. I mean, one of the things we always have to do is, and it's because I'm old and gray, but you have to look at history. I remember very well when Medvedev took over from Putin in a shadow sort of way, and many people in the West said, "Oh my God, he's a new guy. He's his own guy." Well, that was bullshit. And this is the same. I mean, to imagine CCM isn't controlling every step of what this woman is doing, and that the same folks who throw in the bulldozer aren't attempting to control her is just naive. So no, the issue is, what we really need is a granular discussion of the powers within CCM that are pulling her strings. And what can we do? What sanctions can we put on CCM to actually make and incentivize them to move towards rule of law? But it's hocus pocus for us to try to believe we should sit back and give this lady, 3 more years to continue CCM's kleptocracy. Moving ahead with Freeman's charges is a dramatic sign either that she's out of control, has no control, or that she's a chip off the old bulldozer block. None of those are good options.
Interesting observations. My field is human rights, but you've dived into like the political dynamics of the president. As a female, on the continent, we have very few female presidents. So on one hand, it's like, yay, we have a female president, but at the same time, the recognition that she's very much a part of the old guard in terms of CCM, and maybe, as you're saying, what she's doing is not necessarily controlled by her. I wanted to jump to, in conclusion, the U.S. Democracy Summit takes place in December. The list is out of countries that have been invited. The assumption is these are like-minded countries in terms of promoting democracy globally. Tanzania is not on that list. Do you have any thoughts as to what is the significance or implications of Tanzania not being on that list, bearing in mind that there are some individuals who've put across that African countries that have been invited are mere puppets of the West. So it's nothing to write home about that Tanzania is not part of the global community that's gathering to discuss democracy.
Well, look, interestingly, I'm kind of with some of those people who say it's no big deal, because I think the West has lost a tremendous amount of credibility in Africa. I think that the present administration is wildly out of touch, not only in America, but in Africa in terms of what the needs of the people are. I think it's astounding that if you spend time in Africa, you realize that the only politician from the United States that anybody gives a damn about is George W. Bush, who managed to do a heroic job against AIDS in Africa. And we need to understand that the West is, when it comes to democracy promotion, greatly tarnished and damaged. And it isn't just the West that we need to appeal to. And it isn't such a big deal. In fact, from the standpoint of Tanzania, it may be a positive for her that she hasn't been invited. So I'm not going to say that this is more of an indictment, although it is a reflection, I think, of the fact that a lot of the work that's been done by a number of the organizations here have been heard in Washington. We have some Tanzanians sanctioned. We have made a lot of representations in DC in terms of what's been going on, both with Tundu and Freeman. And I think people are listening, but the other area they're listening is the EU. And the EU is incredibly important in terms of not only democracy promotion, but in putting their diplomats out almost in the front lines. They've been very heroic in Tanzania after the election. They've been very heroic in Uganda in trying to protect Bobi Wine. So this is not just an American ball game anymore. But again, thank you for all the work you folks have been doing.
One step at a time, right? We do the best that we can. I know I'm conscious of your time, so I would like to invite participants, including the panelists, if they have any questions for Mr. Amsterdam, I can take them now before he has to step away. Hella, you're going to have to help me out while I figure out, I'm trying to, put everybody on my screen so that I can see which hands have been raised. I can see a hand that's raised, but I can't tell who it is.
I'm looking for it now. Fidelis.
Fidelis, someone Fidelis?
Sure. Yeah. Fidelis, just go ahead, Fidelis, and jump in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, my name is Fidelis Mudimu. I work with frontline defenders in East and Southern Africa as protection coordinator. Mine is not so much of a question, but a comment and an agreement with what Ms. Karume said on when we should be really careful when a leader said they're focusing on the economy, and also your comment on expensive money and more responsible money. Because often when leaders ignore the human rights issues in a country and then focus on the economy, they're probably going to get unscrupulous investors, and that may be corporate or states investors, as we have seen in other parts of Africa, that completely ignore the human rights issue in development and just focus on the money. So I really agree with you, and the situation actually gets worse for communities and also for human rights defenders. And then just another comment that I would like to agree with Mr. Amsterdam was about the passing of Magufuli and the naivety of thinking that things will change. I am Zimbabwean myself, just like Mooya, and we thought the removal of Mugabe was going to make things change. But the systems that have been so entrenched over the years are still remaining, and they will want control, and they will have control. So those are comments, not so much questions. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to address something about Zimbabwe. I did the case before the United Nations against OCHA, where we brought a claim on behalf of an OCHA worker who had been horribly treated by the UN, working in conjunction with Mugabe. The case is called Tanganyika, and we did an entire trial where I won the case because I was able to bring the politics of what was going on to the courtroom. And I was able to demonstrate that the UN had engaged in completely improper conduct based on political backroom deals they had done, and based on the fact that their coordinator in Zimbabwe had shielded Mugabe during the period of time that Mugabe had been in Mozambique. So what I say to human rights defenders is we can never draw a sharp line between politics and the law, specifically in Africa. We need to be better at understanding the politics, because if we're going to protect human rights, we have to do it through political as well as economic activities and training people that, as far as we are concerned, there is no room for a bright line between them in countries without the rule of law and without the separation of powers. So I think that's very important. My only comment to Fatma, which I'd like to just pass on while we're here, is why she's never taken our job offer, but I guess I'll do that offline. But she is one of the greatest advocates in Africa today. And it is a personal tragedy for every Tanzanian every day that she's not before the courts fighting for justice. So with that, unfortunately, I have to take leave because I have another commitment. But I want to thank the ABA and my co-panelists for allowing us to speak. And I look forward to continue all of this work on Tanzania. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Amsterdam, and good day. Hela is on the phone. Sorry, Hela is online. She's also from Amsterdam Partners, and Matthew. They will be able to, if anyone has additional questions on for the Amsterdam team, they'll be able to jump in. To Fidelis's point, I wanted to say that I consider President Samia and Mnangagwa as, two individuals who, literally let a golden opportunity go. Despite belonging to their past administrations, they had an opportunity to, change history. People were willing to wipe the slate clean and give them a chance. But unfortunately, it seems that both of them are failing to take advantage of that opportunity. I will now move on to our next panelist, Mr. Joseph Moses Oleshangay. He is a program officer at the Legal Human Rights Center in Tanzania. As I said, it's one of the leading organizations advocating for human rights in Tanzania. So Mr. Joseph Oleshangay, please, I welcome you to the panel, and I will start with my first question to you, which revolves around the UPR process. So I know, Legal Human Rights Center was heavily involved in coordinating over 200 organizations in Tanzania, human rights organizations, to participate in the UPR process. So for people who might not be familiar with the UPR process, I would like you to just give us a brief overview of your involvement in that process. What were the key issues that you went into the process expecting from the government, and then we can take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Mooya, and the rest, the panelists and the participants. Coming to the question on the UPR, in 2006, the UN and the Human Rights Council started the process of reviewing country situation of human rights. And in 2021, Tanzania was, for the third time, was involved in the process. So the countries are required to prepare their own situation of human rights, but the civil society, for example, are also allowed to present the shadow reports to ensure that at least you can have something to verify from what the government is presenting. So Tanzania was last reviewed in 2016. So LHRC, and as you said rightly, more than 200 other organizations prepared, involved themselves in the process, including preparing the shadow report, submitting it to the government actually before even presenting to the UPR review team. And so LHRC, Human Rights Defense Coalition and others were leading that process of almost more than 28 organizations. So essentially what the civil society organization do is, because they are involved on the ground of what is happening, so is because the government in 2016, for example, has made a commitment in some of the recommendations issued by some states. So our obligation first was to make follow-up of whether the recommendations made that has been accepted by the government were implemented. And for example, in 2016, there were almost 133 recommendations that has been accepted by the government. So we tried to make some scrutiny, some analysis, and trying to assess whether this really has been implemented. And for those that has not been implemented, we prepared our own documents submitting to the government and try to emphasize the government to implement, because it is on commitments to the international bodies. So we submitted that to the government and we prepared our report. We cooperated with some government institutions relating to human rights, and later we submitted the report as required. But now coming to the UPR time actually, which was this November, we as human rights organization, we are also now making follow-up as to whether the government is really committing on what we have submitted and what was actually committed in the second UPR review. Of course, it is unfortunate that even some commitment that has been made in the 2016s has been ignored now. So, of course, there are some recommendations that has been accepted, many of them, but when you come to the rule of law as the subject matter of the day, many of the recommendations rejected by the government, or they said it noted, but actually is another honorable language of saying it is rejected, are essentially centered on the rule of law, the basic freedom, the right to liberties, and others. Those are the substantial parts of the rejected or the recommendation that has not been taken or considered. But it is a bit unfortunate that even the commitment made, for example, if you are to follow the 2016 UPR review, the government, for example, committed that it would be intensifying the efforts to ratify some international obligations, including the Convention Against Torture and others. That has been essentially part of the serious debate in Tanzania about what's happening, the enforced disappearance and others, the pre-determination, which has some element of torture and somehow and other related to that. But in 2021, the government has not accepted the recommendation made on the same topic. So essentially, our commitment was to go through the accepted recommendations and even the one not taken to try to emphasize the government that it really need to rethink and commit, because at the end of the day, some are even contained in our own constitution, despite the fact that it is ailing, but even other are guaranteed, but the government is not willing to commit before the international community, because they know there will be consequence for non-adherence in case of commitments.
Thank you, Joseph, for that overview. I'm curious if, in accepting or declining certain recommendations, particularly the ones related to, fundamental freedoms, freedom of association, expression, and assembly, and the one on torture, did the government give any justification as to why they were declining those recommendations?
Okay, the government issued some reason for some why it is not committing. But for the rest, it didn't give any reason as to why it has been rejected. For example, because there are many recommendations actually, the rejected recommendations now are many than even those accepted by the government. There are only almost 108 recommendations that has been accepted, and more than 130 that has been not taken. So the government has not issued substantially of particularly on each of the very recommendations not considered, but generally issued some statement as, for example, some of the recommendations are against our, what they say, our traditions and customer society. But again, I heard the minister saying some of the recommendations were also like compounded. So you find like there were more than one recommendation. They were willing to accept some, which is like a partly acceptance, but there were no occasion. They were not allowed to accept partly, and I think that's not the case, because in 2016, for example, if you are to go through the UPR documents, there are recommendations that has been partly accepted. For example, there are inconsistencies. For example, you can find like there are recommendations accepted, for example, on raising the marriage age to 18. But again, there are recommendations rejected on the same subject. It is the same, completely the same, but has been rejected. So there was no consistency as to why some of the recommendations has been rejected, and there is no actually a formal like statement saying, particularly, for example, ratifying the Convention Against Torture is against anything. So it will like bring now question to us that maybe the government has stayed with their torture. That's why they don't want to accept. Or for example, Convention Against Enforced Disappearance. The government did not commit to ratify it. Or even, for example, there are recommendations issued that the government, for example, to commit to allow CSOs, political parties, to conduct legitimate activities, which means the lawful that has been registered, they have been registered off, but the government has rejected. There is no actually a particular or specific statement as to why each of the recommendations has been rejected.
Interesting. I know that a fuller report is due from the working group, and we will dive into that when that comes through. And I'm sure, Legal Human Rights Center and other organizations in Tanzania will have a deeper analysis of the entire, outcome of the process. I'm curious, from your perspective, do you have any thoughts on the type of recommendations that were given by the various countries? The UPR process is a peer review process. So these are other countries that are judging, judging Tanzania's human rights record. We've heard from you the view of Tanzania, the Tanzanian government, but I'm curious if you had any thoughts around the type of recommendations given by which countries, other, Western countries, African countries, neighboring countries, if you had any thoughts around the nature of the recommendations.
Okay. There were many recommendations, so to say, more than 200 recommendations issued against or to Tanzania. And if you are to go particularly on regional basis, for example, many of the African countries, so to start with, the recommendation was based on more development program commitments, on some action plans, for example, the right to child, women rights, some developments, issues, and others. But if you are to go for other countries, for example, I have read like the US, Canada, and others, the recommendation has been specifically going to rights and freedoms, and we try to analyze, as LHRC, post now the review, and find that many of the recommendation by states, because as you said rightly, is a peer review mechanisms. Many of the recommendation issued by states that has been rejected, as I say, are mostly centered on the rights, the freedom, the constitutional making process, the rule of law actually. So we try to analyze more than 132 recommendations that has been rejected. Many are centered on the basic rights, the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly, the court system, which actually is part of these discussions, that guaranteeing a more independent judicial system. For example, some country issued, unless you need some specific case, but some country issued like we need recommendation on the independence of electoral management systems. The observation, it was issued by the USA, for example, that Tanzania should commit on accrediting independent organization to observe elections. Almost all of those, the NEC independence, the judicial independence, pre-trial detention, commitments to abolish that, the death penalty, all of them has been rejected.
Yes, I noted that, and it goes to our discussion earlier about how African countries or others have argued that development is, the economy and development is more important than respect for human rights and political participation, and that is secondary. And it's unfortunate it's reflected in the type of focus on the type of recommendations, and of course, the assumption that democracy is imposed on Africa by the West. Lastly, I have, another question related to the UPR process, and thankful for Legal Human Rights Center for, doing an analysis of the past UPR recommendations and what was accepted. And I noted an obvious trend that, let's say in 2011, I think it was 70% of the recommendations were accepted, but at that time there were only 153, recommendations. And I might get the figures wrong, but feel free to go on Legal Human Rights Center's website and look up look up the more accurate ones. And then in 2016, they had 227 recommendations. And at that point, 58% were accepted and 43% were rejected. And then you come to the last UPR session in 2020, the recommendations are more. You have 252 recommendations, and it's inverse now that 43%, that's below half, were accepted and 52% were rejected. So would you say, the title of this conversation is What Hopes Remain for Rule of Law and Openness in Tanzania? But we see a trajectory, a downwards trajectory of the recommendation, an increase in recommendations, and I'm assuming that an increase in recommendations corresponds with a decrease in respect for human rights. And then, of course, a decrease in accepted recommendations also, you could argue, reflects an obstinance, right? Or a rejection basically of the Tanzanian government in terms of adhering to its own constitution and its regional and international standards. So in your view, in conclusion, what would you say, is it a hopeless case that the government has outrightly said, we're not taking these recommendations on fundamental freedoms? Does this mean that all is lost? Do we pack our bags and go home in terms of Tanzania respecting its international regional and international human rights obligations?
Okay. As you said it rightly, for example, while many of the questions are centered on human rights, are centered on Magufuli times, but if you are to look, as you say, the 2016 review, when Magufuli was the president then, there were many commitments than even now. It is the fact, as I think Fatma said and Amsterdam said, there were hope when Samia came. There were hope, and many of ordinary citizens in Tanzania, even those perceived as critics of the past government, issued some statement like there were hope in the future when Samia initially came between April, May, and so on. But those hopes are now going down really. And the current commitment by the government is just a signal of what the future holds in terms of rule of law, the human rights, and others. Because, yes, as you say, the increased number of questions plainly means that there are many questions about the conduct of human rights and rule of law in the country. That's why many people are putting question on. And now the lower acceptance rates, it also means the commitment of the government is not adhering to rule of law, because at times it is to decide to commit yourself on anything you believe. So it is a commitment not to adhere to the rule of laws and others. So I cannot say it is a hopeless exercise, but the UPR to be undertaken, for example, in Tanzania and other countries, that that's going downward in rule of law. Yes, compared to the past, Tanzania is going in a negative trend toward, I can say, the dark in form of rule of law, human rights, and others. But I think there is need to make more commitment in ensuring that at least we can come back to sanity and ensure that the future is made clear for everyone. Because at the end of the day, it is an ordinary citizen who is not being considered maybe by the regime, who will be affected by anything that is being conducted by the regime. So, in my opinion, the UPR review, despite the fact that there are little commitment by the government in adhering to the principles of rule of law and others, actually it gives the UPR process a legitimate continuity, because we are conducting UPR because there are violations being conducted among nations, and states are the primary violators actually of human rights almost everywhere in the world. So when the violations become more pronounced, then many efforts need to be undertaken to ensure that they can be addressed. So as human rights organization, LHRC, and the team were working all together, it just gives us a more reason of continuing working on this, because we are working on human rights. So when violations become more and more, then it is a message to us that we should be working better than we did in the past experiences.
Thank you, Joseph. This is definitely well noted. And of course, it's not all for me, all is not lost if, let's say, for example, 43% of the recommendations were accepted. So even if those relate to social and economic rights, it's still human rights. Exactly. It's still right. So at least we have a starting point, right? So yes. We have come to the end of our session in terms of panelists giving their presentations. I now, open it up to the floor if anybody has questions for Joseph, Fatma, as well as the Amsterdam team. And you can just raise your hand. I will pick you out and you can go ahead and ask your question. It can also be a comment. While I wait for people to gather their thoughts, Fatma, I cut you off and I had one more question for you. Most likely everybody has heard of the recent terrorist attacks in Uganda. Our condolences and thoughts go to the people of Uganda. We've also, in the past, Kenya has been the victim of violent extremism attacks as well. And then you have the crisis in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. And these are three countries that share borders with Tanzania. In your view, and this is a question for Joseph as well, do you think or should Tanzania be concerned with acts of violent extremism, or should it be on the alert? Yes. And that'll be the question. Should Tanzania be concerned with what's happening in the neighboring countries in relation to its security?
I think Tanzania should definitely be concerned. Look, Mooya, this is not the first time that Tanzania has had an attack, a terrorist attack. I mean, in the southern border regions. We've had terrorist attacks in 1998 against the US Embassy in Dar es Salaam. And that was homegrown terrorism. A few weeks ago, we had an individual who attacked the police and basically brought Dar es Salaam to a standstill by taking AK-47s from the police and using them against the police. And it was one person, and sending a message to the head of the police, the Inspector General of Police, that he had had enough of police unfairness. Of course, Tanzania should be concerned about homegrown terrorism. Yesterday, I heard the president speaking to the army. I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday. She spoke to the army and she told the nation that we're in safe hands. The army is in control. We've managed to control our borders. But it seems to be a little naive to think that the army can deal with homegrown terrorism. The army is not built to deal with terrorism. The army is built to deal with conventional warfare, not terrorism. We have seen how acts of terrorism have unfolded in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and the American army, with all its might, was unable to deal with it. What actually brings about terrorism? My view is disenfranchisement. If you disenfranchise the people, they have no other way to react other than to take matters into their own hands, and they become violent and extremist. Now, what we need to do is to ensure that Tanzanians continue to have space to engage with their government. Tanzanians continue to have the right to remove a government by peaceful means and not through acts of violence. And we need to ensure that these rights, the right to engage, the right to remove a government peacefully, are respected by CCM, by the president, by her henchmen, because without that, we are going to go down a very, very sticky path. And I think she's extremely naive if she thinks that the Tanzanian army can deal with homegrown terrorism. The Nigerian army is far better equipped, far larger than the Tanzanian army. I can tell you one thing, it's not having an easy go of Boko Haram up in Western Africa, in Nigeria. And I don't think the Tanzanian army will be able to deal with homegrown terrorism in that way. And I'm not saying that it's suggesting that the Tanzanian army is in any way incompetent. It is just not equipped for that type of warfare. That is why terrorism is so dangerous. What we need to do, what the government needs to do, is to ensure that it is close to its people and that it receives information well in advance of any terrorist attack. Once an attack takes place, it's too late. What the government needs to do is to build confidence in its people so that people can speak to the government and inform the government of potential terrorist acts or cells or conversations. But the way the government is proceeding, I don't believe it's doing a good job in creating confidence with the people. And of course, I am very concerned because Museveni has a very good army, very strong army. They didn't manage to stop the terrorist attack in Kampala yesterday. Kenya has been waging a war of protection, I think, along its northern border with Somalia. And they are constantly under threat from terrorism, and they're not managing to protect themselves from terrorism. And I don't think Tanzania will be able to do it. I think we're playing a very dangerous game. And so when we say to the government of the United Republic of Tanzania that, look, you've got to stop disenfranchising the people of this country. We say it because we want peace. When we say to the government of the United Republic of Tanzania, you've got to allow people to express themselves and you need to act positively, to hear the people and to act positively, and to deal with the people's concerns in a positive way, not to round them up like cattle and throw them into your tiny little cells and lock them up indefinitely because you have the power to do so. That doesn't help the situation. In fact, what you are doing, it's like adding fuel to the flame. And this is not acceptable. You know, I was very saddened yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, when I saw the president dressed in military fatigues, you know, and sort of telling Tanzanians that she's got terrorism under control. Well, dressing in military fatigues is not the way to control terrorism. Terrorism is controlled through let's just say discussions and through ensuring that the people of this country are part of governance and the process of governance, because that's what our constitution says, and they feel heard by their government. If they don't feel heard by their government, they will take the law into their own hands. And this is not good for any of us. So that's my take on terrorism. And I don't think, I think they've got to be very, very careful, Mooya. They're playing a dangerous game.
Absolutely agreed. And I like that you tied it in with the rule of law in terms of individuals being arrested and thrown into, jail for indefinite periods. And, rule of law, we know rule of law and respect for human rights are one of the first casualties of the war against terror. And the US is an example. They haven't done good in that relation. So absolutely, I take the comments on board, and I'm hoping that, moving forward, countries like Tanzania, even Uganda and Mozambique and Kenya will incorporate respect for rule of law, or better incorporate respect for rule of law and human rights in the war against terror. If there are, I don't see any other hands up. Feel free to ask, but I don't see any.
You said if you
sure.
comment on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. First, I agree with what Fatma said. Yes, as a country, we must be concerned for the terror going on in the neighboring country. It is actually too adjacent to us. But being concerned, we must address the real problem that might lead to violent extremism. And the first case of what we can do is ensuring that there is actually rule of law, that when someone has anything or any right has been violated, then there is a place to get the remedy. The very moment the institutions are not working, for example, if the judicial system is not working, that person must seek an alternative. And then it is where we end with the violent extremisms. So, as Fatma rightly said, we need, being concerned is one thing, but we need to address the cause that might lead to violent extremisms, that might lead anyone joining in those groups, is ensuring that anyone can access the institution that guarantee or give justice, like courts and any other institutions, ensuring that the police work professionally, that there are no ruthless violation of human rights, for example, because any deviation from that, you are creating a good ground for anyone to join those groups. And again, as Fatma said, you need that all the citizens be cooperating in that process. The very moment the government is ruthlessly violating people's rights, it means people will not cooperate with the government. It means they cannot give information which is necessary to ensure that you are addressing that issue. If you are to think the military can do that, I think the Afghan government would have worked better with the Taliban, because they have might army equipment than we have, but they didn't. Even the US has been there. They overthrown the Taliban and replaced it with the Taliban, because there were no institution guaranteeing security for everyone, the rights, the courts, and others. So being concerned is yes, we must be concerned, but that is an alert for every one of us to ensure the system are working, that the citizens are allowed to speak their minds, to criticize the government, and to have those functional systems, the right to vote, the right to get any remedy in court. You can tell the government, you are sure that the judges are impartial. Any deviation from that, you are welcoming any sort of violent extremism. Yeah.
Excellent from the both of you. That very much sums up. Don't worry, Fidelis, I'm coming right. Let me actually switch to you, and I think we are at 8:30, 1 hour 30 minutes. Fidelis, if you go ahead and ask your question or share your comment, and we can conclude it.
Thank you very much. My comment is going to be quick, and just invite Ms. Karume to comment on. I mean, the region, East Africa, for us is one of the most homophobic regions that we work in, and not just for LGBTQ plus communities, but also for other key populations and minority groupings. Is there any hope there? Because from my experience, we seem to be going in a never-ending cycle of moving people to safety, and then they get attacked there and they move on to another place. And it also seems that under the previous administration, and still persisting in the current administration, the general population in the country is also taken up, and they've made these vulnerable minority communities even more subject to a lot of pressures and trauma. What is your comment, if any? I'm not like trying to draw you out, but this is just some observation from the work I've done in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Fidelis. You know, I think there's a distinction between the general populace and homophobia within the general populace and the politicization of homophobia. These are two distinct issues. You see, we know that in the West, there are communities which are homophobic. There are people who are homophobic. But in recent decades, there has been a depoliticization of homophobia. And I say that, when I say that, I mean the misuse of homophobia by politicians as a political tool. What has happened in East Africa is homophobia has been politicized, and politicians are using homophobia as a political tool to gain some kind of legitimacy in societies which are homophobic. Now, this amounts to the same thing that we see in East Africa, the use of tribes to gain legitimacy, tribalism to gain legitimacy. It's the same thing, it's the other side of the coin, using differences in people to gain political legitimacy. This is what is whipping up this sentiment of homophobia. Even in societies such as Zanzibar, where we are very much, let's say, accepting of homosexuals. Unfortunately, politicians have used homophobia to whip up sentiments in the general populace against homosexuals. And when we think about homosexuals, they're such a minority. They really are such a minority. And it surprises me that politicians keep talking about this small minority instead of just leaving them alone. Why do politicians in East Africa need to keep discussing this small minority and use them to legitimize their political base? This is something I fail to understand. And as I said, it's weak politics because they don't have important issues to discuss. You know, we have much, much more important developmental issues that we need to put on the table, such as education, poverty reduction, human rights, democracy, and someone pops up like a jack in a box and talks about homosexuality and bases his whole political legitimacy on homosexual bashing. I mean, it just goes to prove what weak politicians we actually have.
Thank you, Fidelis, for that question, and Fatma for the response. And you know, as you were speaking, you could have just replaced East Africa or Tanzania with Zimbabwe, and Fidelis would agree that you know, the former President Mugabe was very, very vocal against the LGBTI community, and you know, used that as a distraction against real issues, into, you know, the economy, political issues, and still do. You know, citizens get so hung up on anti-LGBTQ sentiments and would rather just say, okay, I'm voting for this individual because of that, and then, you know, and then that's it, and forget about bread and butter issues. So thank you for that. I know there's a question around any comment about Tanzania's changed constitution, but I would like, you know, the both of you to probably include that. I'm not too sure what the comment is, but maybe just comment around the, you know, conversations around constitutional reform. But in concluding, just wrapping it up, We are, a number of us are international organizations here, and you've heard this, numerous times. For me to be, a few words in terms of what should the international community be doing to ensure that the rule of law in Tanzania, as well as the democratic space, it does not continue to shrink further and is expanded. Mr. Oleshangay said that we shouldn't give up, we continue to work, and of course the work that you are doing, the both of you are doing in Tanzania, and how best we can support that, and we'll round up from there. Joseph, you can go first.
Okay. Thank you. What the international community should be doing is, first, before being citizens, we are human beings. And being human beings, we are part of the global human populations. So it means there are rights that Tanzania must protect, and in case of non-protections, the international community must come in and play its role, because we are part of the human populations. Yes, there are these issues like debate, like, no, you cannot encroach into our internal affairs. But when we're fighting for example, political independence, they are not saying maybe US should not intervene, because the nationalism process was an internal process. They were seeking assistance from many countries outside our own small nations. So I think many platforms, including the UN and other democratic stakeholders, should be pressing as possible to ensure that Tanzania respects the international, not only treaties and other commitments, but the standards on, for example, democracy, for the rule of law. We have discussed about, for example, the independence of the judiciary. One of the cases is that of the Fatma and others. There are many. 2 days ago, actually, certain lawyers were refused to access their clients. It's just part of what we have been saying of Fatma and others. So we don't have that independent bar, which means also we don't have independent judiciary. So international organization, including the ABBA and others, the UN mechanisms, should be pressing to ensure that Tanzania commit first to international human rights mechanisms, the charters and others. For example, the SCPR, the Convention Against Torture. The international committee should be pressing on that. Again, last year we have held our general elections. The outcomes has been the most contested, I think, in the history of Tanzania. It's just a matter of fact. We should not be wishing to go that route again. So, okay, and this is my comment on the constitutional reforms. I think we have the obligation internally as citizens to ensure that our system works, and our system will only work if we have a better guiding principle. We have a better constitutions, because the constitution that we have actually is not capable of taking us any better. If you have the constitution that says someone can violate the law, can commit massacre, and without any consequence, that's not a constitution to take us a day far away. So is my opinion that as we are working as citizens to ensure that our process works, our institutions work better, but the international organization has also an obligation actually to ensure that we are not left out, because this country does not belong to the politicians. It does not only belong to those in the government, it belongs to us all. So there are rights. The right to life should be protected by everyone, including from outside. We should not be waiting to listen some statement that this is just our own internal process. My right to life is not an internal process of this country, because I was born not to be a Tanzanian. I can be of anywhere. And the consequence is not only for us citizens. Fatma said, for example, to be able to develop, we need working systems. No one can be interested to come and invest here if we don't have functional systems. So if we want to benefit from maybe investing here, then we must also have the obligation to ensure that the system really functions. This is my brief comment on that.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Fatma, your final words?
So my final word is, I think I agree with Joseph that we have to be invested in the constitutional reform process ourselves as citizens. We have never actually been invested in that process. We've never taken part in the process. The constitutions, the various constitutions of the United Republic of Tanzania have been thrown at us, and we've just accepted them as they are. And we as a people have to be invested in this process, and we have to want the constitution to change, and we have to negotiate this constitution amongst ourselves with the people who at the moment are holding the power and the firepower, let's face it, because they are not slow to use it against the people, the firepower, when they think it's, when they feel that they are at risk of losing what they want. So I do think partly we are to blame. We have to take control of the situation ourselves. However, it is also very important for the international community not to not to create a country, not to accept impunity. So when we have leaders who kill, who maim, who do not accept the international order, they should not be rewarded by being given, immense sums of money, loans, grants, to hold up a system which they have mismanaged, an economic system they have mismanaged that is falling apart, that is heaving, hospitals that are not functioning. I always wonder, when I hear donor countries or international communities saying, oh, well, we're doing this for the people. We're giving money, we're building hospitals, we're assisting the government to build hospitals and to have medication in these hospitals because we care about the people. Can you possibly care about the people more than our government does? If so, do you not think then that the government should care more and should finance these hospitals accordingly and should not be coming to you begging bowl in hand, seeking your assistance to fund hospitals when, in my country, the president's entourage is 37 cars. I don't know, 37 cars, 40 cars, who knows? I stopped counting at 22. And, with these huge military vans which stop, jam, that's what they call, they're jammers, aren't they? They jam signals and so on. I mean, really? Do we really need that? And so when you fund a government that spends billions on protecting itself and camouflaging itself as a government that respects human rights and rule of law, and yet doesn't care about its people, then I don't really think you care about the people. You care more about the government than you do about the people, because you're allowing this government to take public funds and spend it on protecting itself and entrenching the system and entrenching itself in power, as opposed to giving social welfare to the people. And this is something that I think donor communities have to think very carefully about, how far aid entrenches these authoritarian governments.
Couldn't agree more with both of you and your sentiments. For me, so many takeaways from this conversation. I can't possibly begin to summarize each and every one of them. I know that Amsterdam was recording the panel, and as I said, it's public, so we'll likely put it up on our individual websites. Please follow the 3 panelists for updates on Tanzania and their work that they're doing. In conclusion, I just wanted to say, that Tanzania is not unique. Sadly, it's not unique in terms of what's going on in the country, on the continent. Countries like Zimbabwe, Cameroon, we've got Ethiopia, Uganda. It just seems that the entire continent is on fire one way or the other. And my key takeaway from this conversation is that, respect for rule of law and human rights plays a fundamental role, right, in ensuring, political stability as well as economic development. And it's unfortunate that economic development is often separated from respect for rule of law and human rights. So this brings us to the end of our conversation. Once again, thank you very much to the Amsterdam team for hosting us. And okay, it seems I'm frozen, but I'm still here, for hosting us. And I hope that we can have, more conversations around Tanzania. The US, I'm based in the US, so the US Democracy Summit is coming up in a few weeks. And we'll have a few events, or probably 1 or 2 events around that, around democracy and the US or Western foreign policy on, on the continent and the future for democracy on the continent. I will end there, and thank you so much for the panelists, and once again to Amsterdam and team. Good day.
Thank you all.